My life was measured in brushstrokes and solitude. The old house I'd inherited from my grandmother was my shell, my studio, and my sanctuary, a place where the loudest sounds were the scrape of a palette knife against canvas and the weary sigh of the floorboards. I painted landscapes, mostly vast, empty things filled with brooding skies and skeletal trees. They were lonely paintings, I knew, but they were honest. They were a reflection of the quiet, ordered world I had built for myself, a world where the mail arriving at 11:42 a.m. was the most reliable point of human contact. He was new. The old mail carrier, a woman named Carol with a booming laugh and a penchant for gossip, had retired last month. Her replacement was a quiet man whose name I only learned from the small embroidered patch on his blue shirt, Leo. He moved with an economy of motion that I, as an artist, found endlessly fascinating. There was no wasted energy, no hurried shuffle, just a steady, rhythmic gait that carried him up my 3 porch steps, the soft thud of his boots a metronome for my morning. For weeks, our interactions were limited to the metallic clank of the mailbox lid. I would be at my easel by the front window, pretending to be absorbed in the delicate work of mixing a perfect Payne's gray, but my focus would be entirely on him. I watched the way the sun caught the sharp line of his jaw, the slight furrow of his brow as he sorted the letters, the casual strength in his hands. He was a study in unassuming confidence, a figure of comforting predictability who had, without his knowledge, become the anchor of my day. I never spoke. I just watched. And I painted. My skies became a little less bleak. Then came the package. It was large, a flat, rectangular box of art supplies I'd ordered weeks ago and forgotten about. It was too big for the mailbox, which meant it required a signature. It required interaction. I heard the familiar thud of his boots on the porch, but this time they were followed by a pause, and then 2 sharp, decisive knocks on the door. My heart hammered against my ribs. A simple knock, and I was a mess of social anxiety and irrational panic. My hands were stained with ultramarine blue and raw umber. My t-shirt had a hole in the collar. I probably smelled of turpentine. I took a deep, shaky breath, wiped my hands on a rag, and pulled the heavy oak door open. He was closer than I'd ever seen him. Close enough that I could see the faint constellation of freckles across the bridge of his nose, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the temples where his cap hadn't covered it. His eyes were a deep, warm brown, like rich soil after a rain, and they held my gaze with a calm directness that felt both unnerving and deeply soothing. He wasn't smiling, not quite, but the corners of his mouth were turned up in a way that suggested he was on the verge of one. "Package for Alex Reed," he said. His voice was lower than I'd imagined, a soft baritone with a gravelly edge. It was the kind of voice that made you lean in a little closer. "That's me." I managed, my own voice sounding thin and reedy in comparison. He held out a small electronic scanner and a stylus. "Just need a signature here, please." Our fingers brushed as I took the device. A spark, a tiny jolt of static electricity, arced between us. It was nothing, a common occurrence in the dry autumn air, but it felt like a current running straight up my arm and into my chest. I looked up, startled, and met his eyes again. He didn't pull back. He just watched me, his expression unreadable, as I scrawled a shaky, illegible signature onto the screen. I was acutely aware of the blue paint smeared on my knuckles, the raw, chapped skin of my hands. "There you go," I said, handing it back. Our fingers touched again, this time for a fraction of a second longer. It felt deliberate. Or maybe I was just imagining it. I was always imagining things. He took the scanner, his gaze dropping to my hands for a moment before returning to my face. "Artist?" he asked, nodding toward the smear of paint. I nodded, suddenly self-conscious. "Something like that, cool." He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, then turned to retrieve the large box from the porch railing. He handed it to me, his movements efficient and strong. "Have a good one, Alex," he said my name. It sounded different in his voice. Solid. Real. "You too," I whispered, as he turned and walked back down the steps, his rhythmic stride carrying him away down the sun-dappled sidewalk. I stood there in the doorway, holding the heavy box, my heart still thudding a frantic, unfamiliar rhythm. The air where he had stood seemed to hum with a residual energy, and it smelled faintly of clean laundry, autumn leaves, and something else, a subtle, warm, masculine scent that was just him. He had been on my porch for less than 2 minutes, but the entire landscape of my quiet, ordered world had shifted on its axis. He rang twice, and when he left, he took my breath with him. The days that followed were a quiet torment of my own making. My obsession, once a passive, background hum, became a sharp, demanding focus. The window next to my easel was no longer just a source of light. It was my lookout post. I learned the sound of his truck from 2 blocks away, the particular squeal of the brakes as he stopped at the house on the corner. I'd find myself holding my breath as he approached, my paintbrush hovering uselessly over the canvas, every nerve ending straining for the sight of him. He always gave a little wave now, a slight lift of his hand or a nod in my direction if he saw me in the window. Each time, my stomach would perform a sickening lurch, a mix of exhilaration and terror. I would wave back, a small, hesitant gesture, feeling like a fool. My internal monologue was a constant, exhausting cycle of analysis. Did that wave mean something? Was that smile just professional courtesy, or was there something more behind it? He glanced at my porch light for a second longer than necessary. Was it flickering, or was he looking at the house, at my life? I was a detective investigating a crime with no evidence, a scholar studying a text written in a language I didn't understand. His micro-expressions were my clues. The slight crinkle at the corners of his eyes when he smiled at Mrs. Henderson's yapping terrier. The way he ran a hand over the back of his neck when the sun was particularly hot. The focused set of his jaw as he navigated a broken sprinkler head on the miller's lawn. I collected these details like precious artifacts, turning them over and over in my mind, trying to assemble a portrait of the man who delivered my mail. My paintings changed again. The colors grew warmer, the shadows softer. I started painting the street outside my window, the way the late morning light filtered through the canopy of the old maple tree, the precise shade of blue of his uniform against the green of the lawns. I was painting him, without actually painting him. I was painting the world as it looked when he was in it. About a week after the first package, another one arrived. This one was small, a tube of expensive sable brushes I treated myself to. I knew it would require another signature. I spent the entire morning in a state of high alert. I changed my shirt 3 times, finally settling on a plain gray one that was clean and hole-free. I washed the paint from my hands until my skin was raw. I even ran a comb through my hair. The preparation felt both ridiculous and absolutely necessary. When the knock came, it was softer this time. Just one rap of his knuckles against the wood. I opened the door, my pre-written casual greeting dying on my lips. He was leaning against the doorframe, a small smile playing on his lips. He looked tired. There were faint shadows under his eyes, and his uniform looked a little rumpled. "Another one for you," he said, his voice a low rumble. He held out the scanner. As I reached for it, he shifted his grip, and his hand covered mine for a moment. It wasn't a brush of fingers this time. His palm was warm and slightly calloused, covering the back of my hand, his thumb resting near my pulse point. The contact was brief, lasting only a second or two, but it was electric. Time seemed to slow down, the ambient sounds of the neighborhood, a distant lawnmower, the chatter of birds, fading into a dull roar. All I could feel was the weight and warmth of his hand. All I could see were his dark, unreadable eyes, searching my face for something. I must have made some small sound, a hitch in my breath, because his smile softened. He slowly withdrew his hand, and the absence of his touch was a physical ache. "Just here," he said, his voice softer now, tapping the screen of the scanner. I signed, my hand trembling so badly that my name was nothing more than a jagged line. I felt a flush creep up my neck, a hot wave of embarrassment, and something else, something wild and hopeful. I handed the device back, careful not to touch him again, terrified of what that contact would do to my already frayed composure. He handed me the tube. "New brushes?" he asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He remembered. He remembered I was a painter. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "The old ones were shot. Gotta have the right tools for the job," he said with a nod. He lingered for a moment, his gaze drifting past me into the house, toward the easel visible in the living room. "Bet you create some amazing things in there." It wasn't a question, but a statement. A statement of fact. And for some reason, that simple expression of faith from this near stranger meant more to me than any praise I'd ever received from a gallery owner or critic. He saw me. not just as a resident on his route, but as someone who creates. I try, I said, and for the first time, a real smile touched my lips. Well, he said, pushing himself off the doorframe. See you tomorrow, Alex. He turned and walked away, and I watched him until he disappeared around the corner. I leaned against the door, the cool plastic of the tube in my hand, my body thrumming with a nervous energy I hadn't felt in years. A hand on mine, a lingering look, the sound of my name in his voice. It was all circumstantial evidence, meaningless trivia to anyone else. But to me, it was everything. It was the beginning of a story I was terrified and desperate to write. The universe, it seems, has a penchant for irony. For weeks, I had been orchestrating my life around these fleeting, seconds-long encounters. Then, a freak autumn windstorm decided to intervene, ripping a heavy branch from the ancient oak in my front yard and sending it crashing down directly onto my mailbox. It was a cartoonish level of destruction. The cheerful red flag was bent at a 90-degree angle, and the metal box itself was crumpled like a discarded soda can, hanging precariously from its post. I discovered the carnage the next morning, my heart sinking with a disproportionate sense of dread. My one link to him, my excuse for seeing him every day, was broken. I stood on my porch, coffee cup in hand, surveying the damage. It was a mess. The branch was too heavy for me to move alone, and the mailbox was clearly beyond repair. Just as I was contemplating the logistics of calling a tree removal service, his mail truck rounded the corner. My stomach did its familiar flip. He pulled up to the curb, got out, and stood for a long moment, just looking at the disaster in my yard. He had a small stack of letters in his hand, my mail, with nowhere to put them. He walked up the lawn, his boots navigating the scattered leaves and twigs. He stopped a few feet away from me, his eyes on the mangled mailbox. "Looks like you had a rough night," he said, his tone a mix of amusement and sympathy. "You could say that," I replied, gesturing with my mug. The oak tree decided to redecorate, he chuckled, a low, pleasant sound. "Well, I've got your mail," he held up the letters. "But I'm not sure where to, here is fine," I said, stepping forward and taking them from him. Again, that brief, electric touch of our fingers. This time, I was ready for it, and I savored the fleeting warmth. He looked from the broken box to the heavy branch. "You going to be able to move that thing?" "Eventually," I said, trying to sound more capable than I felt. "I'll probably have to call someone." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze assessing the situation. He was wearing a thin jacket over his uniform, and the wind pressed it against the solid lines of his chest and shoulders. He looked strong, capable, everything I wasn't. "I've got a chainsaw in my truck," he said, so casually it took me a second to process. "You do?" "Yeah," he shrugged. "My route takes me past some rural properties. You'd be surprised how often a fallen tree blocks a driveway. I get off in a couple of hours. I could swing back by, cut that up for you. If you want." The offer hung in the air between us, charged with possibility. It was more than neighborly kindness. It was an excuse, an opportunity, a door creaking open that I was terrified to walk through. My mind raced with all the reasons to say no. It would be an imposition. I would be awkward. I didn't know what to say to him for more than 30 seconds. I hear myself saying yes. I'd really appreciate that. I can pay you for your time." He shook his head immediately, a firm, decisive motion. "Don't worry about it. Just helping out. I'll be back around 3. 3 is perfect," I said, my voice sounding impossibly calm. "All right." He gave me one last look, a small, genuine smile that made my chest ache. "See you then, Alex." He walked back to his truck, and I stood on my porch, clutching my letters like a lifeline. He was coming back. He was going to be in my yard, in my space, for hours. The thought sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated panic through me, followed immediately by a wave of giddy, terrifying excitement. The quiet, ordered world I had so carefully constructed was about to be invaded by the steady, rhythmic sound of a chainsaw and the overwhelming presence of the man who held it. The next few hours were a blur of nervous energy. I cleaned my house with a frantic intensity, as if he were coming for a formal inspection and not to dismember a tree in my front yard. I scrubbed sinks, vacuumed rugs, and even dusted the tops of my bookshelves. I was acting like a teenager preparing for a first date, and the absurdity of my own behavior was not lost on me. I was a grown man, a professional artist, and I was panicking because the mailman was coming over to do yard work. At precisely 3 o'clock, his beat-up blue pickup truck pulled into my driveway. He got out, and he was no longer in his uniform. He wore a faded pair of jeans that fit him in a way that was profoundly distracting, a plain black t-shirt that stretched across his broad shoulders, and sturdy work boots. Seeing him out of his postal service attire was a revelation. He wasn't Leo the mail carrier anymore. He was just Leo, a man with a chainsaw, who was now walking toward my front door. I met him on the porch, my hands shoved deep into my pockets to keep them from shaking. "Hey," he said, that easy smile back on his face. "Ready to make some noise?" "Ready as I'll ever be," I said. The next 2 hours were a strange, surreal dance of cooperative effort. He was all business at first, pulling the chainsaw from his truck and assessing the fallen branch with a professional eye. He worked with the same efficient, no-wasted motion grace that I'd observed on his mail route. The roar of the saw filled the air, a violent, masculine sound that was the complete antithesis of my quiet life. I watched, mesmerized, as he expertly sliced the massive branch into manageable logs, sawdust flying around him like golden snow. My role was to drag the cut logs to a pile near the edge of my property. It was hard work. The wood was heavy and awkward, and my studio soft muscles protested with every lift. We worked in a comfortable, surprisingly easy rhythm, falling into a pattern without needing to speak much over the noise of the saw. But in the moments when he'd switch it off to refuel or adjust the chain, the sudden silence was deafening, charged with unspoken things. It was during one of these lulls that the breakthrough happened. We were both leaning against his truck, catching our breath. I was sweaty and covered in sawdust, my arms aching, but I felt more alive than I had in years. I offered him a bottle of water, and he took it, his fingers brushing mine. This time, the touch felt different, less like a spark and more like a current. It was familiar. "Thanks," he said, taking a long drink. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his eyes scanning my yard. "You've got a nice place here. Quiet. It's my grandmother's house," I said. "I inherited it a few years ago. Quiet is kind of my default setting." He looked at me, his gaze thoughtful. "I get that. My job is all go, go, go. People, dogs, traffic. Sometimes I just want to find a place with no noise." He paused, taking another drink of water. "Do you ever get lonely out here all day? Just you and the paint?" The question was so direct, so personal, it caught me completely off guard. No one ever asked me that. People assumed that because I was quiet, I was content in my solitude. They didn't see the deep, aching loneliness that was my constant companion. I looked away, toward the house, toward the window I always watched him from. I could tell him the truth, or I could give him the easy, practiced answer. For some reason, with him, I wanted to be honest. Sometimes, I admitted, my voice low. Most of the time, the work is enough company. But sometimes, yeah, the quiet gets pretty loud. He nodded slowly, his eyes holding mine. He wasn't looking at me with pity, but with a profound and startling understanding. It felt as if he could see right through the carefully constructed walls I'd built around myself, right into the lonely, yearning heart of me. "I know what you mean," he said softly. "The loudest quiet in the world is coming home to an empty house, and in that moment, something shifted between us. He wasn't just the handsome mailman I had a crush on. He was a person who understood the specific weight of the silence I lived in. He had shared a small, vulnerable piece of himself, and in doing so, he had given me permission to do the same. The distance between us, the professional boundary of mail carrier and resident, evaporated in the warm afternoon air, leaving just two men, standing by a truck, covered in sawdust, sharing a moment of unexpected, profound connection. We finished clearing the last of the branches as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple that I itched to capture on canvas. My entire body ached with a satisfying weariness. We had a respectable pile of firewood stacked by the curb and a clear front yard. The mangled mailbox still sagged on its post, a comical monument to the day's events. "I'll have to get a new one of those," I said, gesturing to the metallic corpse. "I can help you install it, if you want," Leo offered, wiping his hands on a rag. "It's easy enough. Just need a post-hole digger and a bag of concrete." The casual way he offered to extend our time together, to weave himself further into the fabric of my life, sent a fresh wave of hope and panic through me. You've done more than enough already, I said, though my heart was screaming yes. Please, never leave. Seriously, Leo. Thank you. I don't know what I would have done. It was nothing, he said, starting to pack his chainsaw back into its case. Besides, I can't have one of my favorite stops on the route looking like a disaster zone. My brain snagged on his words. One of my favorite stops. Was that just a nice thing to say, or did he mean it? Was I his favorite stop because of the big tree that offered shade in the summer, or was it because of me? My mind, my relentless, overthinking mind, went into overdrive. I need to do something. I can't let this moment end. I can't let him just pack up and drive away, leaving me to wonder what was real and what was just my own wishful thinking. The fear of rejection was a cold, heavy stone in my gut, but the fear of regret, of letting this slip away, was even heavier. Can I offer you a beer or something? I asked, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. As a thank you. It's the least I can do. He stopped what he was doing and turned to look at me. The fading light cast long shadows across his face, making his expression difficult to read. The silence stretched, and with every passing second, my anxiety mounted. I had misread everything. He was just being nice. A friendly, helpful guy. And I had made it weird. Just as I was about to babble an apology and retreat back into my house, he broke into a slow grin. It transformed his entire face, crinkling the corners of his eyes and revealing a warmth that seemed to radiate from him. "I'd like that a lot," he said. Relief washed over me so intensely my knees felt weak. We sat on my porch steps, the same steps he climbed every day, as twilight settled over the neighborhood. The air grew cool, carrying the scent of cut wood and damp earth. I handed him a cold beer, and our fingers brushed as he took it. This time, I didn't flinch. I let my fingers linger, just for a second, and I thought I felt the slightest pressure from his in return. We sat in a comfortable silence for a few minutes, drinking our beers, watching the last vestiges of color fade from the sky. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was a shared quiet, a moment of mutual decompression after a day of hard work. "So," he said, finally breaking the quiet. He turned his body toward me, leaning his back against the porch railing. "An artist. You must see the world differently than most people." "I don't know about that," I said with a shrug. "I just notice things. Colors. The way light falls on a surface. The shape of things, the shape of your shoulders," my brain added helpfully. "The color of your eyes in the morning sun." "Like what?" he asked, his voice genuinely curious. "What do you notice right now?" It was a test. A gentle challenge. I took a breath. I noticed the way the streetlights are turning everything a sort of hazy, sodium orange, and how it makes the green of the leaves on that maple look almost black. I noticed the blue of your truck is almost the same shade as the sky right at the horizon. I paused, then decided to be brave. "And I noticed that you have a little fleck of sawdust on your eyelash." He blinked, then laughed, a real, hearty laugh that echoed in the quiet street. He rubbed at his eye. Did I get it? "No, other eye," I said. My heart is pounding. This is it. A moment. An opening. "Here. Hold still." I leaned in close. My world narrowed to the space between us. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his soap, mixed with the day's honest sweat and sawdust. I could see the tiny lines radiating from the corner of his eye, the dark stubble on his jaw. I raised my hand, my fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before gently brushing the speck from his lashes. My thumb grazed his cheekbone. His skin was warm, rough. He didn't move. He didn't even seem to be breathing. His eyes, dark and deep in the twilight, were fixed on mine. The air crackled. The space between our lips seemed to shrink, to become a powerful magnetic field pulling us closer. This was no longer about a piece of sawdust. This was a loaded, silent conversation, and my body was screaming a language I barely understood. He was the one who broke the spell. He cleared his throat and leaned back slightly, putting a few precious inches of space between us. The loss of proximity was a physical blow. "Thanks," he said, his voice a little husky. He took a long swallow of his beer, his eyes looking out at the street, at anything but me. I had gone too far. The cold dread washed over me again, more intense this time. I had ruined it. I had turned a simple act of kindness into something charged and uncomfortable. "I should let you get home," I mumbled, starting to stand up. "You must be tired, Alex." He said my name, and the quiet authority in his voice stopped me. I sat back down, my heart in my throat. He set his beer bottle down on the step with a soft clink. He turned to face me fully, his expression serious. The playful, easygoing mailman was gone, replaced by someone more focused, more intense. "You know I didn't swing by with a chainsaw just because your mailbox was broken, right?" he asked, his voice low and steady. I couldn't speak. I could only shake my head, a tiny, jerky movement. "And I've been waving at your window every day for the past month hoping you'd do more than just wave back." I stare at him, my mind a blank slate. He sees me. He's been seeing me this whole time. The waves, the lingering glances, they weren't just in my head. They were real. "I see the way you look at me," he continued, his voice softer now, more vulnerable. "When you think I don't notice." I was just waiting for an excuse. The tree gave me 1 inch the world tilted. The carefully constructed narrative I had built in my head, the one where I was the lonely, invisible observer pining for the unattainable man, was shattering. He wasn't unattainable. He was right here, on my porch, confessing that he had been pining right back. I started, but my voice failed me. What could I possibly say? The truth was a massive, terrifying thing lodged in my throat. He seemed to understand my silence. He reached out, not quickly, but with a slow, deliberate motion that gave me plenty of time to pull away. He didn't touch my face or my hand. He gently took the beer bottle from my nerveless fingers and set it down next to his. Then, he laced his fingers through mine. His hand was large and warm, his grip firm and reassuring. It was the most astonishingly intimate thing I had ever felt. It was an anchor in the dizzying swirl of my emotions. "Is this okay?" he whispered, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. I looked down at our joined hands, then back up at his face. And in his eyes, I saw it all. The same yearning, the same hope, the same fear that I had been living with for weeks. The truth finally broke free. "Yes," I breathed. "It's okay." He held my gaze for a long moment, a silent question passing between us. And then, slowly, he leaned in. He closed the small distance that remained, and he kissed me. It wasn't a hard, demanding kiss. It was soft, questioning, and deeply gentle. It was the taste of beer and sawdust and cool night air. His lips were firm and warm against mine, and the slight rasp of his stubble was an intoxicating friction. I felt a lifetime of loneliness and longing and fear meld away in that one, simple contact. My hand, the one not held captive in his, came up to cup his jaw, my fingers sinking into the soft hair at his nape. I kissed him back, pouring every unspoken thought, every secret painting, every moment of observation into the gesture. It was a kiss that said, "I see you too. I've been seeing you all along." When he finally pulled back, it was only by an inch. He rested his forehead against mine, his breath warm on my skin. His eyes were closed. "Okay," he murmured, a soft, satisfied sound. "That's okay." We stayed like that for a long time, foreheads pressed together, our hands intertwined, the sounds of the neighborhood fading into a distant hum. The world was no longer a place I observed from behind a window. It was here, on my porch, warm and real and holding my hand. And it was more beautiful than any landscape I could ever hope to paint. He didn't stay the night. We talked for another hour on the porch, the conversation easy and natural now that the massive weight of unspoken feelings had been lifted. We talked about his dream of one day owning a small plot of land, of my frustration with a gallery in the city, of his terrible taste in music and my love for old black and white films. We were filling in the outlines of each other, adding color and texture to the sketches we'd made from a distance. When he finally left, he kissed me again, a deep, lingering kiss at my front door that left me breathless and dizzy. "I'll see you tomorrow," he'd promised, and the words, once a simple statement of his job, were now loaded with a thrilling new meaning. I slept better that night than I had in years, but I woke the next morning to the familiar, creeping tendrils of anxiety. The darkness of my room felt different, charged with the memory of the previous day. Was it real? Had I dreamt it all? The logical part of my brain knew it had happened. The pile of firewood in my yard was tangible proof. But the insecure, lonely part of me, the part that had been in charge for so long, whispered that it was too good to be true, that he would wake up with regrets, that the harsh light of day would expose our porch-lit confession for the foolish, impulsive mistake it was. I was a wreck by 11:30. I paced my studio, unable to paint, unable to think. Every passing car was his mail truck. Every sound was his footstep on the walk. I felt like I was going to be sick. What would happen when he arrived? Would he be formal and professional, his eyes avoiding mine, a silent apology for his lapse in judgment? Would he hand me my mail and hurry away, leaving me with nothing but the ghost of a kiss and a broken mailbox? When I finally heard the familiar squeak of his brakes, my heart leaped into my throat. I hurried to the window, my usual lookout post, but then I stopped myself. I couldn't watch him from a distance anymore. I couldn't be the observer. I had to be a participant. Taking a deep, shaky breath, I walked to the front door and opened it, stepping out onto the porch just as he was walking up the lawn. He saw me, and his step faltered for just a second. His face was unreadable. He wasn't smiling. My stomach plummeted. This was it. The rejection. I braced myself for the impact. He walked up the steps, the usual small bundle of mail in his hand. He stopped in front of me, his eyes searching my face. The silence was agonizing. "Hey," he said, his voice quiet. "Hey." I replied, my own voice barely audible. He held out the mail. I reached for it, my hand trembling. As my fingers closed around the envelopes, he didn't let go. Instead, his hand covered mine, his thumb stroking gently over my knuckles. It was a deliberate, possessive, and profoundly reassuring gesture. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low murmur meant only for me. "I woke up this morning thinking about your smile," he said. "Just so you know, the relief was so sudden, so absolute. It was like a physical release. A breath I didn't even know I was holding escaped my lips in a shaky sigh." I looked up at him, and his face had softened, the corners of his mouth turned up in that gentle, almost smile that I adored. He wasn't regretting it. It was real. I woke up thinking I'd imagined the whole thing. I confessed, my voice thick with emotion. "Nope," he said, his thumb continuing its soothing motion over my hand. "Not imagined." He squeezed my hand gently before finally letting go. "Gotta finish my route." He gave me a small, private wink, then turned to leave. Just as he stepped off the porch, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Well, isn't that cozy?" It was Mrs. Gable from across the street. She was standing by her prize-winning rose bushes, a trowel in one hand, her face a mask of pinched disapproval. She had seen the whole thing. The lingering touch, the intimate exchange. My entire body went rigid. A hot flush of shame and fear crawled up my neck. This was what I had always been afraid of. The judgment, the whispers, the confirmation that my life, my feelings, were something to be scrutinized and found wanting. My first instinct was to flee, to run back inside my house and bolt the door, to retreat to the safety of my shell. But then I looked at Leo. He had stopped at the bottom of the steps, and he turned to look at Mrs. Gable. He didn't look angry or embarrassed. He just looked calm. He then turned his head and looked back at me, still standing frozen on the porch. He held my gaze for a long moment, and in his eyes, I saw a question, a choice. We could let her comment, her judgment, define this moment, or we could not. And in that instant, something inside me shifted. I had spent my entire life hiding, making myself small to avoid this very kind of attention. But I wasn't the same person I was yesterday. Yesterday, I was alone. Today, I was not. I took a breath. I looked from Leo's steady, supportive gaze to Mrs. Gable's sour face. And I smiled. A wide, genuine, unapologetic smile. I raised the hand that Leo had just held and gave him a small, deliberate wave. Leo's answering grin was dazzling. He gave a nod, first to me, then a perfectly polite, dismissive nod to Mrs. Gable, before turning and continuing on his route with that same steady, confident stride. He didn't hurry. He didn't look back. He just was. I stood on my porch for a long time after he was gone, the mail still clutched in my hand. Mrs. Gable eventually huffed and went back inside her house. The small test was over, and I felt a quiet sense of victory. I hadn't crumbled. I hadn't hidden. For the first time, I had stood my ground, not with anger or defiance, but with a simple, quiet declaration of my own happiness. The world hadn't ended. The sun was still shining, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I would see him again tomorrow. That evening, just as I was cleaning my brushes, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. My heart leaped. "It's Leo. Hope this is okay. I got your number from the package slip." Felt weirdly invasive, but also necessary. I smiled, my thumbs hovering over the screen as I tried to compose a reply that was casual and cool, not desperate and giddy. Perfectly okay. Better than a note tied to a rock and thrown through my window. His reply came back instantly. Damn, that was my plan for tomorrow. You ruined the surprise. The banter was easy, playful. We texted for an hour, the conversation flowing more freely than it ever could have face-to-face, buffered by the safety of our screens. We talked about nothing and everything. Finally, another message came through. I'm off this weekend. I was thinking I could come by Saturday and we could tackle that mailbox. And then, after, maybe we could go somewhere that doesn't involve manual labor. A real date. A real date. The words glowed on the screen. It was a conscious choice. A deliberate step forward. This wasn't just a fleeting connection born of proximity and a fallen tree. This was something he wanted to build. I'd like that a lot. I typed back, my heart thudding a steady, joyful rhythm against my ribs. Good. It's a date, then. Saturday arrived draped in the golden light of a perfect autumn morning. I was up with the sun, a nervous, happy energy thrumming through me. I made coffee and sat on my porch, watching the world wake up. It looked different now. The colors seemed brighter, the air cleaner. It was the same street, the same houses, the same trees, but my perception of it had been fundamentally altered. I wasn't just looking at it anymore. I felt a part of it. Leo arrived a little after 9, not in his work truck, but in the same beat-up pickup from before. He was wearing a soft, gray Henley and jeans, and he was carrying a post-hole digger over his shoulder like it weighed nothing. He smiled as he walked up the path, a real, open-mouthed smile that made me feel like I was the only person in the world. Morning, he said, his voice warm. Ready to get our hands dirty? We spent the next couple of hours installing the new mailbox. It was a surprisingly intimate process. We had to work in close proximity, our shoulders brushing, our hands occasionally bumping as we measured the depth of the hole or leveled the post. Leo was a patient teacher, showing me how to mix the concrete to the right consistency, how to make sure the post was perfectly plumb. There was an easy camaraderie between us, punctuated by moments of charged silence when our eyes would meet over the bag of concrete or the spirit level. At one point, as I was holding the post steady while he shoveled dirt around its base, a smear of wet concrete fell onto my cheek. You've got a little something, he said, chuckling. He reached up, and with a tenderness that seemed at odds with his calloused, capable hands, he used his thumb to wipe the concrete away. His touch lingered, his thumb stroking my cheekbone, his eyes dark and focused. The world narrowed again to the space between us, the smell of damp earth and setting concrete, the warmth of his hand on my skin. He leaned in and gave me a soft, dusty kiss. Much better, he murmured against my lips. After the mailbox was securely in place, a proud, sturdy sentinel at the end of my driveway, we went inside to clean up. I had been nervous about him coming into my house, into my private sanctuary. It felt like the ultimate act of vulnerability, letting him see the chaotic, paint-splattered heart of my world. He walked into my studio and just stopped. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just looked around, his eyes taking in the canvases stacked against the walls, the cluttered tables of brushes and paints, the easel standing in the center of the room with my latest work in progress. I held my breath, waiting for his judgment. Finally, he turned to the painting on the easel. It was the street outside my window, the view from my lookout post. It was a scene bathed in late morning light, and in the distance, a small, indistinct figure in a blue uniform was walking away. This is, he started, his voice soft with something I couldn't quite identify. Oh, recognition? This is my walk, yeah, I said quietly. I've been painting you for weeks. The confession hung in the air, raw and exposed. He turned from the painting to look at me, his expression one of profound tenderness. He crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly. I buried my face in his shoulder, breathing in his scent, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart against my chest. All that time, he whispered into my hair. All that time, you were watching me, and I was watching you watch me. We went on our date that night. We went to a small, quiet Italian restaurant downtown. We sat in a corner booth and talked for hours, the conversation flowing as easily as the wine. He told me about his family, about the younger brother he helped put through college. I told him about my grandmother, about how she was the one who first put a paintbrush in my hand. We were two lonely people who had found each other through a series of happy accidents and unspoken invitations. When he drove me home, he walked me to the door. The new mailbox stood at the end of the walk, gleaming under the porch light. It was a symbol of our new beginning, something we had built together. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice low. "Yes," I said, without a moment's hesitation. The story ends not with a grand, dramatic flourish, but with a quiet, simple moment of domestic intimacy. We didn't fall into bed in a tangle of desperate limbs. Instead, we made coffee and took it out to the porch. We sat on the steps, shoulder to shoulder, our thighs pressed together, sharing the comfortable silence as we watched the moon rise over the quiet street. His arm was around my shoulders, his hand resting on my arm, his thumb drawing lazy circles on my skin. I leaned my head against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. The quiet didn't feel loud anymore. It felt peaceful. It felt full. I thought about my life before him, a life lived in shades of gray, a life of observation without participation. I had been painting lonely landscapes because that was all I knew. But now, my world was filled with color, with warmth, with the tangible presence of another person. He hadn't just fixed my mailbox. He had fixed a part of me I didn't even know was broken. He turned his head and pressed a soft kiss to my temple. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured. I looked out at the familiar view, the street, the trees, the houses bathed in moonlight. It was the same scene I had painted 100 times, but it was completely new. "I'm thinking," I said, my voice soft with a contentment so deep it was almost overwhelming, "that I finally feel like I've come home."